The nursery corridor should have been sealed for evening count, yet the log terminal outside the young prince's chamber showed no entry for the 21 o'clock verification. The door was not forced, only slightly ajar, as if someone expected to return within seconds. The assigned royal guard paused, gloved hand resting on the frame. The lights were on. The bed was empty, and the silence felt deliberate. The nightly verification process began at precisely 2200 hours, when the palace corridors had settled into their disciplined quiet and the ceremonial wings were sealed for the evening. The senior royal guard stood in the dim security annex adjoining the private family wing, the glow of the moniker reflecting faintly across the polished brass buttons of his uniform. Outside the narrow windows, winter pressed against the glass, and the temperature in the stone corridors had begun to drop. He followed the standard checklist without deviation: perimeter sensors, interior motion grids, private suite confirmations. When he reached the prince's digital presence confirmation, his hand paused over the console. The final escort scan, required after private tutoring hours, was absent. The system showed the tutor's departure badge logged at 1940. It showed the corridor guard rotation at 1950. It did not show the child's biometric confirmation upon re-entry into the secured residential suite. He leaned closer to the screen, adjusting the log filter. No delayed upload, no pending authentication, just an empty field where a confirmation stamp should have been. The absence itself was small, almost administrative, but procedure did not allow small omissions in matters concerning a royal minor. He checked the internal clock against the master system. Timestamps were synchronized. He cross-referenced the escort officer's badge record. It registered access to the private lift, but did not confirm final suite entry. A faint hum from the ventilation system filled the room as he straightened. In his years of service, most discrepancies had explanations: faulty scanners, forgotten wristbands, delayed digital sync. Still, confirmation of a child's secured location was not optional. He stepped into the corridor, boots muted against the runner carpet, and walked the length of the private wing. The sconces along the wall cast steady amber light. Nothing appeared disturbed. At the prince's suite entrance, 2 junior staff members were concluding linen inventory. They greeted him with composed nods. "His Highness returned after tutoring?" he asked evenly. One attendant answered without hesitation that the child had been escorted back shortly after sunset and was now resting. The response came quickly, rehearsed by routine. The guard studied their expressions, calm, perhaps slightly inconvenienced by the question. He did not accuse. Instead, he requested visual confirmation under standard child protection protocol. There was a brief exchange of glances between the attendants before one accessed the suite door. Inside, the sitting room lamps were dimmed. The tutor's materials were gone. The bedroom door stood slightly ajar. The bed, however, was empty. The blankets were turned back as though prepared, not used. A faint draft moved the curtain near the balcony doors, though they remained locked. The guard's breathing remained controlled, but something tightened in his chest. He checked the adjoining washroom. Unoccupied. The silence within the suite was complete, undisturbed by sleep or movement. He stepped back into the corridor and closed the door softly, ensuring the attendants did not yet see the shift in his expression. The digital omission no longer felt administrative. It felt intentional, or at the minimum, concealed. Protocol required immediate escalation to command, yet escalation would trigger formal review of every officer assigned to the wing, including himself. A false alarm would stain records permanently. He looked once more toward the closed suite door, then toward the silent stretch of corridor leading back to the security annex, weighing whether to recheck the entire wing quietly before activating an official alert. He chose the narrowest initial action permitted by regulation, a silent internal sweep prior to formal escalation, limited to the secured residential quadrant. He signaled discreetly to the corridor officer at the junction to maintain position and admit no one without direct authorization. The guard then accessed the secondary stairwell used exclusively for household staff and security rotations. The stairwell air carried the cool scent of stone and polish. Each landing light activated as he descended one level to the study rooms where private tutoring concluded nightly. The classroom door stood closed. Inside, chairs were aligned, the chalkboard wiped clean. There were no signs of interruption. He examined the biometric reader beside the lift shaft. The tutor's badge had scanned out. The prince's wrist tag, assigned solely for internal location tracking, showed inactive status since 1952. Inactive did not mean removed. It meant outside registered sensors. He felt the weight of that distinction. A child within secured grounds should never register beyond internal grids without corresponding gate authorization. He contacted the central monitoring desk through encrypted channel. His voice remained steady as he requested confirmation of the prince's live location ping. A pause followed, longer than procedural norms allowed. The response returned, "No active signal detected within residential perimeter." The phrasing was careful. It did not yet imply absence from palace grounds. It implied a gap. He instructed the desk not to broadcast the irregularity until he completed one additional cross-check. Moving toward the service corridor adjacent to the administrative wing, he noticed the faint smell of recently circulated air, cooler than surrounding passages. The corridor lights were dimmed to energy-saving mode. At its entrance, a security panel indicated an override within the past 2 hours. The override required senior-level credentials beyond standard household authority. His jaw tightened slightly. He entered his own clearance to access the log summary. The system displayed a manual bypass at 1954, authorized under executive administrative privileges. No accompanying child transfer documentation appeared in the registry. He stood still for several seconds, absorbing the implication. Someone with elevated authority had opened a restricted passage during the precise window the prince's escort confirmation should have occurred. His training instructed patience, secure written clearance before investigating any area touched by executive override. His instinct measured time differently. Every minute without confirmed location widened risk. He initiated a discreet internal alert to 2 trusted guards to reposition near the administrative wing without visible mobilization. The palace remained outwardly calm. Distant clocks chimed the quarter hour. From the upper floors, no alarm had been raised. He knew that escalating now would involve senior officials who might insist on internal explanation before search expansion. He also knew that delay compounded exposure. Standing beneath the subdued light of the service corridor, he prepared to contact command formally, aware that once the report was filed, the matter would no longer be contained within quiet review. The formal report was transmitted at 22:23 hours, marked as a Level 2 child location discrepancy under Palace Safeguarding Code. The senior royal guard remained in the security annex while awaiting acknowledgement from Central Command, hands resting behind his back, posture unchanged despite the gradual tightening in the room's atmosphere. The response arrived within 3 minutes. He was instructed to present himself to the night command office immediately. The walk across the internal corridor felt longer than usual, though the distance had not changed in years. Inside the command office, 2 ranking officers reviewed the digital logs projected across a wall display.
The missing biometric confirmation was visible as a blank interval between tutoring dismissal and residential suite entry. One officer adjusted his glasses and suggested a delayed synchronization. The other asked whether the suite had been physically checked. The guard confirmed it had. He did not embellish. He did not speculate. He presented timestamps and the service corridor override log, noting the executive credential attached to it. The room quieted at that detail. Executive administrative credentials were rarely involved in residential wing movements, particularly without prior notice to security. A call was placed to the administrative liaison on duty. The liaison arrived within minutes, composed, coat draped neatly over one arm as though summoned for a routine clarification. He reviewed the log with mild impatience and stated that the override had been issued to facilitate a brief private discussion arranged by a senior advisor earlier in the evening. According to him, the prince had been temporarily relocated for supplemental instruction and was returned shortly after. The explanation did not align with the empty suite. When asked for documentation, the liaison replied that written authorization was being processed and cautioned against premature alarm that could disturb the household unnecessarily. The phrase carried weight. Palace stability depended on discretion. Raising a public alert without confirmation would ripple upward quickly, potentially reaching the king before facts were fully assembled. One of the command officers suggested allowing 10 additional minutes for confirmation from the advisor's office. The senior royal guard felt the measured pressure settle in the room. Not overt intimidation, but institutional gravity encouraging restraint. He requested verification of the corridor camera covering the service passage used during the override window. The technician on call accessed the feed archive. The screen displayed a static frame stamped 1953, followed by 4 minutes of signal interruption before normal recording resumed. The interruption aligned precisely with the override activation. The technician reported a temporary maintenance glitch. The guard asked whether maintenance had been scheduled. There was no record of such work. Silence followed again, more substantial this time. Still, no one declared it a breach. Instead, the liaison reiterated that the prince's welfare was not in question, and that senior offices would confirm shortly. The guard remained standing, aware that every passing minute without direct visual confirmation increased the gravity of his initial decision. He requested permission to expand the internal search radius to include the administrative wing. The liaison replied that access to that wing required written clearance from executive authority. The conversation had shifted from clerical delay to boundary enforcement. At 22:34 hours, the guard requested that the discrepancy be formally logged in the Royal Household Incident Registry, elevating the matter beyond informal review. One of the command officers hesitated before authorizing the entry. Once recorded, the registry automatically notified the Royal Household Secretary's office and, by protocol, created a traceable chain that could not be quietly amended. The liaison's expression tightened slightly as the digital confirmation tone sounded. The guard then asked a direct question. Can any present officer confirm the prince's current physical location? No one answered immediately. The liaison stated that the senior advisor responsible for the supplemental instruction had retired for the evening and would respond shortly. The guard informed him that the suite was currently empty. A brief pause followed on the line, barely perceptible but present. The advisor suggested the child may have been relocated to another family chamber for the night and recommended verifying with household staff before escalating further. The guard replied that no relocation orders had been logged. The advisor then reminded the room that administrative privilege allowed for certain discretionary movements without prior disclosure to security to preserve educational confidentiality. The implication was clear. Not all actions required guard oversight. The command office fell quiet again. Finally, one officer stated that given the absence of confirmed location, the king must be informed per safeguarding statute. The liaison objected, warning that waking the sovereign without confirmed threat could result in disciplinary review for those involved. The guard felt the decision pivot towards him. He had initiated the registry entry. He had insisted on expansion. To withdraw now would reduce immediate friction, but leave the uncertainty unresolved. He requested that notification proceed. The command officer nodded once and reached for the secured line that connected directly to the king's private secretary, understanding that once the call was made, the matter would move beyond administrative containment. At 22:41, the senior advisor returned the call. His voice, transmitted over speaker, was calm and controlled. He confirmed that he had requested temporary access for private educational discussion regarding upcoming ceremonial duties. He stated the child had been returned safely to residential quarters before 2000 hours. The guard informed him that the suite was currently empty. A brief pause followed on the line, barely perceptible but present. The advisor suggested the child may have been relocated to another family chamber for the night and recommended verifying with household staff before escalating further. The guard replied that no relocation orders had been logged. The advisor then reminded the room that administrative privilege allowed for certain discretionary movements without prior disclosure to security to preserve educational confidentiality. The implication was clear. Not all actions required guard oversight. The command office fell quiet again. Finally, one officer stated that given the absence of confirmed location, the king must be informed per safeguarding statute. The liaison objected, warning that waking the sovereign without confirmed threat could result in disciplinary review for those involved. The guard felt the decision pivot towards him. He had initiated the registry entry. He had insisted on expansion. To withdraw now would reduce immediate friction, but leave the uncertainty unresolved. He requested that notification proceed. The command officer nodded once and reached for the secured line that connected directly to the king's private secretary, understanding that once the call was made, the matter would move beyond administrative containment. At 22:41, the senior advisor returned the call. His voice, transmitted over speaker, was calm and controlled. He confirmed that he had requested temporary access for private educational discussion regarding upcoming ceremonial duties. He stated the child had been returned safely to residential quarters before 2000 hours. The guard informed him that the suite was currently empty. A brief pause followed on the line, barely perceptible but present. The advisor suggested the child may have been relocated to another family chamber for the night and recommended verifying with household staff before escalating further. The guard replied that no relocation orders had been logged. The advisor then reminded the room that administrative privilege allowed for certain discretionary movements without prior disclosure to security to preserve educational confidentiality. The implication was clear. Not all actions required guard oversight. The command office fell quiet again. Finally, one officer stated that given the absence of confirmed location, the king must be informed per safeguarding statute. The liaison objected, warning that waking the sovereign without confirmed threat could result in disciplinary review for those involved. The guard felt the decision pivot towards him.
He had initiated the registry entry. He had insisted on expansion. To withdraw now would reduce immediate friction, but leave the uncertainty.
The king's private secretary answered on the second ring. His tone was alert despite the late hour. The command officer summarized the discrepancy without embellishment: missing biometric confirmation, executive override, temporary surveillance interruption, and current inability to confirm the prince's location within the secured residential suite. The line remained silent for several seconds before the secretary responded that His Majesty would be informed immediately. The guard stood motionless, aware that the situation had crossed from procedural irregularity into sovereign concern. Within minutes, authorization was granted to conduct a controlled search of any interior area necessary to verify the child's safety, including administrative corridors previously restricted without written clearance. The permission was precise: proceed with minimum personnel, avoid disruption, document every access point, no public alarm, no broadcast beyond essential units. The guard acknowledged the order and selected 2 experienced officers to accompany him, men who understood discretion and did not speculate aloud. They moved through the eastern passage toward the service corridor, where the override had been logged. The palace at that hour carried a different quality of silence, heavier and more deliberate. Footsteps echoed faintly against stone arches. As they approached the restricted door, the guard studied the access panel again. The executive credential remained visible in the log, timestamp unchanged. He recorded the display with his body camera before entering his own authorization. The lock disengaged with a restrained mechanical click. Inside, the air felt cooler, the corridor narrower than the residential wing, lit by recessed fixtures that cast long shadows along the walls. This passage was seldom used except during renovations or discreet administrative transfers. The guard advanced slowly, observing the floor for scuff marks or displaced dust. Near the midpoint of the corridor, he noticed a faint smear along the brass edge of a secondary door, recent contact where polish had dulled. He signaled the others to hold position while he examined the biometric reader. It showed a secondary access at 1956 under the same executive credential. No exit log followed. That absence was more concerning than the first. If the prince had been returned, an exit authorization should have registered. The guard felt the narrowing pressure of implication. They proceeded to the secondary door. Behind it lay a small reception chamber leading toward the private administrative wing used by senior advisors for confidential meetings. Protocol required waiting for written counter-signature before entering any chamber under executive jurisdiction. He paused, recalling the precise wording of the king's authorization: verify safety in any interior area necessary. The instruction did not explicitly override executive privacy statutes, but safeguarding precedents was embedded within palace code. He placed his hand on the handle, measuring the legal margin in which he could act without overstepping authority. The 2 officers behind him remained silent, awaiting direction. The corridor's ventilation hummed steadily, indifferent to hierarchy. After a brief moment, he entered his clearance into the secondary panel and pushed the door inward. The reception chamber beyond was modest, furnished with a narrow table and 2 upholstered chairs positioned beneath a chandelier dimmed to half illumination. No one was present. The air carried the faint scent of extinguished candle wax, though no candles were currently lit. To the right stood another reinforced door, leading into the main administrative conference suite. Its biometric reader was dark, indicating internal privacy lock engaged from within. The guard approached carefully. He could hear nothing beyond the door, no voices, no movement. He requested access through the panel. The system denied entry, citing active executive session mode. That status could be initiated manually from within without external logging. He contacted command via secure channel, informing them of the locked chamber and absence of exit record. The response returned that the king had authorized immediate override if the child's safety could not be visually confirmed. The guard entered the emergency code issued moments earlier by the private secretary. The lock disengaged after a 2-second delay that felt longer. He opened the door slowly. The conference chamber lights were low, only perimeter fixtures illuminated. At the far end of the polished table, seated in a high-backed chair too large for his frame, was the prince. His shoes did not reach the floor. A folder lay open before him, pages filled with printed schedules and ceremonial outlines. He looked up as the door opened, not startled, but uncertain. There were no signs of injury, no immediate distress. The room was otherwise empty. The guard stepped inside, posture formal, but voice quiet as he asked whether His Highness was well. The child nodded and stated that he had been told to wait for further instruction. He mentioned that an advisor had left briefly and would return. The guard scanned the room, no additional exits unsecured, no concealed movement. He approached the table and noted that the documents appeared to detail future public appearances, annotated with handwritten notes not typical of tutoring materials. The temperature in the room felt cooler than the rest of the wing, as though ventilation had been increased deliberately. He informed the prince that they would return to the residential suite immediately. The child complied without question, gathering nothing from the table. As they exited, one of the accompanying officers photographed the interior setup for record. The guard ensured the chamber door was secured and that all access logs were preserved. Walking back through the corridor, he understood that the issue had shifted from missing location to unauthorized relocation under executive privilege. The child had been placed in a secured chamber without notification to Protection Command, surveillance interrupted, and documentation absent. The discovery resolved the immediate uncertainty, but deepened the institutional conflict. Ahead, at the corridor junction, he could see a figure approaching under measured stride, the senior advisor whose credential had opened the passage, arriving precisely as the prince was being escorted away.
The senior advisor slowed as he approached, his expression composed, hands clasped behind his back in practiced restraint. He did not appear surprised to see the prince being escorted from the administrative wing. The corridor lighting cast sharp lines across his face, emphasizing neither guilt nor apology, only calculation. The royal guard halted at a respectful distance, positioning himself subtly between the advisor and the child. The prince remained quiet, glancing once toward the advisor before looking back to the guard. The silence in the passage felt structured, as if each man understood the importance of tone before words were spoken. The advisor acknowledged the guard with a slight nod and stated that the session had concluded earlier than expected. His voice was even, almost instructional. He explained that the relocation had been arranged to prepare the prince for upcoming constitutional responsibilities, material considered too sensitive for standard tutoring rooms. The guard listened without interruption. He then stated calmly that no relocation order had been filed with Protection Command and that surveillance coverage had been interrupted during the transfer window. The advisor responded that executive educational sessions were not obligated to disclose curricular movements to security in advance, especially when confidentiality was paramount. The implication was subtle but clear. Safeguarding protocols should not interfere with administrative discretion. The guard did not challenge the premise directly. Instead, he asked whether the advisor could confirm the exact duration the prince had remained in the chamber unattended. The advisor paused briefly before replying that he had stepped out to retrieve additional briefing documents and had expected to return within minutes. The guard noted that 4 minutes of camera interruption coincided with the transfer and that no exit log documented the child's return to the residential suite.
The advisor's gaze hardened slightly at the reference to logs. He suggested that over-reliance on digital systems risked undermining professional judgment. The prince shifted his weight, the sound of his shoe brushing the corridor carpet barely audible. The guard lowered his voice and informed the advisor that under safeguarding statute, any minor relocated beyond the residential wing required notification to command, regardless of rank. The advisor countered that the statute allowed discretionary interpretation when acting under sovereign mandate. Neither raised his voice. The exchange remained measured, but tension gathered in the narrow space between them. Finally, the guard stated that he would escort the prince back to his suite immediately and that a full report of the relocation would be submitted for verification by His Majesty. The advisor did not object, though the faint tightening of his jaw suggested resistance contained rather than surrendered. As the escort resumed toward the private wing, the guard sensed that the confrontation had only begun. The prince's return to the residential suite was documented with meticulous precision. Biometric confirmation was recorded, time-stamped, and cross-verified against central monitoring. 2 additional guards were positioned discreetly at the wing entrance, while household staff were instructed to maintain routine appearance. No announcement was made beyond essential channels. Once the child was settled and direct visual confirmation secured, the senior royal guard proceeded to the command office to finalize his incident report. The document he compiled avoided accusation. It relied on sequence. Missing digital confirmation at 1952, executive override at 1954, surveillance interruption lasting 4 minutes, secondary access with no recorded exit, child located unattended in administrative conference chamber at 2258. He attached still frames from the corridor feed and biometric logs without commentary. When he finished, he transmitted the report simultaneously to command and to the king's private secretary, as required under safeguarding escalation once a minor had been moved without notification. Within 30 minutes, an instruction arrived. His Majesty requested direct presentation of findings at first light. The phrasing was formal, neither supportive nor critical. Word of the incident began circulating quietly among senior staff. Some regarded the guard's insistence as procedural rigidity. Others recognized the implication of bypassed protections. Before midnight, the advisor submitted a written memorandum asserting that the relocation had been conducted under educational necessity and that security notification had been deemed operationally excessive. The memorandum did not address the camera interruption. It framed the event as a difference in interpretive boundaries between administrative privilege and protective oversight. The guard read the document once, then placed it alongside his own report. Outside, the palace remained calm, its exterior lights illuminating stone facades unchanged by internal friction. Inside, however, a line had been drawn, not through confrontation, but through documentation. Before ending his shift, the guard conducted one final visual check of the prince's suite. The child was asleep, breathing steady, unaware of the institutional tension unfolding beyond the closed doors. The guard stood for a moment in the quiet hallway, aware that safeguarding the crown sometimes required resisting those who served it from positions of greater rank. At dawn, he would stand before the king and present facts that could not be quietly amended. Morning light entered the palace through high eastern windows, pale and controlled, illuminating the long gallery that led to the king's private council chamber. The senior royal guard stood outside the carved oak doors at precisely 0700 hours, uniform immaculate, report folder secured beneath his arm. The air carried the faint scent of polished wood and cooled stone. No ceremonial guards were posted at this early hour, only 2 discreet security officers assigned to the sovereign's inner perimeter. When summoned inside, he stepped into a chamber arranged not for spectacle, but for governance. The king sat at the head of a narrow council table, the royal household secretary positioned to his right, the senior advisor to his left. No one spoke immediately. The guard advanced 3 measured steps, halted, and presented the report. His voice remained even as he summarized the sequence without interpretation. He described the missing biometric confirmation, the executive override, the 4-minute surveillance interruption, the locked conference chamber, and the discovery of the prince unattended. He avoided speculation regarding motive. The king listened without visible reaction, fingertips resting lightly against the table's edge. When the guard concluded, silence lingered long enough to register weight rather than hesitation. The king then asked a single question. Was the child at any point physically endangered? The guard answered truthfully that no visible harm had occurred and that the prince had appeared calm, though left without immediate supervision in a secured but unmonitored chamber. The senior advisor interjected, reiterating that the session had been educational and authorized within his administrative scope. He acknowledged the surveillance interruption, but attributed it to a temporary systems recalibration initiated to preserve confidentiality of briefing materials. The household secretary requested documentation of that recalibration. None was immediately produced. The king shifted his attention to the advisor and asked whether Protection Command had been notified prior to relocation. The advisor responded that he had exercised discretion to avoid unnecessary procedural delay. The room grew still again. The king's gaze returned to the guard. "Did you act beyond your mandate?" he asked. The question carried neither accusation nor reassurance. It sought boundary clarity. The guard replied that he had acted within safeguarding statute once location confirmation could not be verified, and had sought sovereign authorization before overriding executive chamber privacy. He did not defend his decision beyond that. The king nodded once, absorbing the chronology as structure rather than narrative. He instructed the household secretary to initiate an internal review of authorization chains related to minor relocations within palace grounds. The advisor's posture stiffened slightly, though he remained composed. The king concluded the session by stating that the prince's protection superseded administrative convenience, regardless of rank. The words were measured, not forceful, but they settled definitively within the chamber. By mid-morning, written directives began circulating through secured channels. Effective immediately, no minor within the royal household could be relocated beyond designated residential or educational zones without simultaneous notification to Protection Command and automatic biometric confirmation on transfer. Executive override privileges would remain intact for matters of state security, but not for internal child movement. Surveillance systems were to be immune from manual interruption unless co-signed by both administrative and security authorities. The policy language was precise, avoiding direct reference to the previous night, yet unmistakably shaped by it. The senior royal guard submitted a formal acknowledgment of the revised protocol, though the document maintained that his intent had been instructional rather than negligent. It conceded that procedural transparency should have been observed. The king did not request resignation, nor did he issue public reprimand. The matter remained internal, preserved within institutional memory rather than public record. Later that afternoon, the senior royal guard returned to the private wing to resume standard oversight. The corridors appeared unchanged, sunlight warming the stone floors, staff moving with routine efficiency, distant sounds of preparation for afternoon engagements. Yet beneath the normal rhythm lay a recalibrated boundary. The prince passed through the sitting room accompanied by his tutor, offering a brief, polite nod to the guard before entering the study. There was no sign he understood the administrative conflict his absence had triggered. The guard acknowledged him with the same composed formality as always. At 19:52 that evening, the biometric confirmation registered precisely on schedule. The system displayed a clear, unbroken chain of custody from classroom to residential suite. The guard observed the confirmation without outward reaction, then continued his patrol along the corridor. He understood that vigilance did not always confront external threat. Sometimes it corrected internal imbalance. The palace walls remained steady against the horizon, symbols of continuity and power. Within them, however, protocol had been quietly reinforced, not through confrontation, but through adherence. As night settled again over the estate, the guard resumed his post beneath steady amber lights, aware that safeguarding the crown required not only loyalty, but the discipline to question authority when protection demanded it.